When Elena, a struggling artist clutching a worn leather portfolio in the biting November wind, paused to help a little girl who had tripped on the cobblestones, she never imagined the chain of events she was about to unleash. She did not know that the girl's father, a man with haunted eyes hidden beneath the brim of a simple baseball cap, was Julian Croft, a billionaire recluse drowning in the silent ocean of his own grief for 5 long years. And she could never have foreseen that when her portfolio fell open, revealing the faded photograph of the woman she missed every single day, the little girl would point a trembling finger and scream a sentence that would shatter the fragile peace of 3 lives. "Daddy, that's my mommy." Before I continue the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers so I can keep bringing you stories like this every day. It's just one click for you, but it means a lot to me. Thank you. The cold that seeped through the thin soles of Elena's boots was a familiar adversary, a constant companion in her daily pilgrimage through the city's indifferent streets. It was a cold that mirrored the ache in her heart, the hollow space left by a sister she had lost not to death, but to silence and distance. Her portfolio, heavy with sketches that felt more like prayers than art, was her only shield. Inside, tucked into a worn sleeve, was the photograph, a ghost of a smile, eyes that held the same deep brown as her own, a face that was her mirror image. It was Clara, her twin, captured in a moment of untainted joy before a world of wealth had swallowed her whole, leaving Elena with nothing but this paper memory and a chasm of unanswered questions. On this particular afternoon, the park was a symphony of gray. The sky, the pavement, the weary faces of strangers. Elena walked with her daughter, Maya, a small, bright spark in the overwhelming monochrome. Maya's laughter was a fragile melody against the city's harsh rhythm, a sound Elena guarded with the ferocity of a dragon protecting its last piece of gold. Julian Croft, a ghost of a different sort, watched his own daughter, Lily, play near the fountain. He had shed his bespoke suits and chauffeured cars for the anonymity of worn denim and a quiet that clung to him like a second skin. He sought these moments of normalcy, hoping the mundane world would somehow cauterize the wound that refused to heal, the wound left by the woman in the photograph. He saw Lily stumble, her small frame meeting the unforgiving ground, and his heart seized with a familiar, suffocating panic. But before he could move, before his carefully constructed anonymity could shatter, he saw another woman rush forward. He saw her gentle hands, the kindness in her touch as she helped his daughter up, her voice a soft murmur of reassurance. He saw his daughter, safe. And then he saw the portfolio fall, its contents spilling like secrets onto the cold stone, a cascade of charcoal faces, of sketched hands and lonely cityscapes, and then the photograph. Clear, undeniable, and utterly impossible. It was her face. It was his Clara. He felt the world tilt on its axis, the sounds of the city fading into a dull roar in his ears. He was frozen in a moment, suspended between the past and the present, a ghost seeing a ghost. Lily, whose world had been defined by the absence of a mother she only knew from stories and carefully curated albums, saw the photograph and recognized her instantly. It was the same smile her father described in his softest voice, the same light in her eyes he said now lived in Lily's. To a child of 6, there was no complexity, no room for impossibility, only the raw, unshakable truth of what she saw. Her voice, shrill and piercing, cut through the cold air, a cry of pure, unadulterated recognition that struck Julian like a physical blow. "Daddy, that's my mommy!" The words echoed in the sudden stillness that surrounded them, a declaration that defied all logic. For Elena, the scream was a bizarre interruption, a child's fantasy. She looked from the tear-streaked face of the little girl to the man who was now staring at her, his face a mask of disbelief and raw, agonizing pain. His eyes, no longer hidden, were wide with a terror she could not comprehend. He looked at the photograph, then at her, then back at the photograph, as if caught in a horrifying optical illusion. The resemblance between herself and Clara had always been startling, a fact that had been a source of girlish fun once and a source of deep sorrow now. But she had never expected it to provoke such a visceral reaction in a complete stranger. The man, the millionaire whose name she did not know, did not speak. He couldn't. The past had reached out and wrapped its icy fingers around his throat. It was a ghost story coming to life in the middle of a public park. The carefully built walls around his heart crumbled into dust, exposing the raw, bleeding wound beneath. He did what any cornered, wounded animal would do. He fled. He scooped Lily into his arms, her small body trembling with confusion and her own burgeoning tears, and he ran. He ran away from the woman with his dead wife's face, away from the impossible photograph, away from the tidal wave of grief that threatened to drown him right there on the cobblestones. He ran as if escaping the scene of a crime, leaving Elena standing alone, the photograph at her feet, a bewildered Maya tugging at her coat, and the little girl's haunting words hanging in the air like a curse. The wind whipped around her, colder than before, carrying the faint scent of rain and the profound, unsettling feeling that her life, in all its quiet predictability, had just been irrevocably fractured by a ghost she thought was only her own. Elena stood rooted to the spot, the portfolio forgotten, her mind struggling to process the scene that had just unfolded. The man's reaction was not one of simple confusion. It was a deep, primal panic, a flight of sheer terror that left an unsettling silence in its wake. Maya, sensing her mother's distress, tightened her grip on her hand. "Mommy, why did that man run? Was he scared of the picture?" Elena looked down at her daughter's innocent, questioning face and had no answers. How could she explain the complexities of grief, of resemblance, of a fractured past to a child? How could she explain it to herself? She gathered her sketches, her fingers trembling slightly as she picked up the photograph of Clara. She looked at her sister's smiling face, a face that was her own and yet belonged to a life she had never known. The little girl had called this woman Mommy. The thought was absurd, a child's mistake, yet the father's reaction lent it a terrifying weight. She tucked the photo away, the familiar comfort it usually brought now replaced by a chilling unease. As she and Maya made their way home, the city lights beginning to blur against the darkening sky, Elena couldn't shake the image of the man's haunted eyes. It was a look she recognized, a reflection of the same loss she carried within her, but magnified, twisted into something sharp and fearful. Her small apartment, usually a sanctuary of warmth and creativity, felt different that evening. The single radiator hissed a lonely tune, and the smell of turpentine and oil paint seemed to mock her attempts to create beauty in a world that felt suddenly gray and menacing. She tried to sketch, to lose herself in the familiar lines and shadows on the page, but the only face she could draw was the one from the park, a face contorted in a silent scream of memory. She had spent years mourning the loss of her connection to Clara, imagining her sister living a life of unimaginable luxury, a world away from her own struggles. She had never once considered the man her sister had married, had never known his name or his face. Clara's letters, frequent at first, had become sparse and then stopped altogether, leaving a void filled with Elena's own imagined narratives of disapproval and abandonment. Now, a new, terrifying possibility began to seed itself in her mind. What if the man in the park was more than just a stranger? What if the little girl's cry was not a mistake? The idea was so outlandish, so dramatic, that she almost laughed at its absurdity. But the feeling of dread persisted, a cold knot in the pit of her stomach. She was a woman who lived her life in the quiet margins, defined by her art, her daughter, and her quiet dignity. The encounter in the park was a violent intrusion, a stone thrown into the still waters of her carefully managed existence, and she could feel the ripples spreading, threatening to pull her under into a current of unknowns she was not prepared to face. Julian did not stop running until the heavy oak door of his penthouse apartment slammed shut behind him, the sound echoing the violent closing of a chapter he thought had been sealed forever. He leaned against the wood, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Lily was crying softly in his arms, her confusion now turning to fear at her father's strange and frantic behavior. He slid down the door to the floor, holding her tight, his multi-million-dollar view of the city skyline a meaningless, mocking panorama of a world he no longer felt a part of. He had spent 5 years meticulously constructing a fortress around his heart. After Clara's death in that horrific, sudden car accident, he had retreated from the world, from the pitying glances of friends and the grasping hands of business associates. He had funneled all his energy, all his love, into Lily, the last precious piece of Clara he had left. He had become a master of control, his life a carefully orchestrated routine designed to minimize pain and avoid any reminder of the vibrant, loving woman who had been ripped from his life. And in one afternoon, a stranger in a park with his wife's face had demolished that fortress with a single photograph. The woman. He couldn't get her face out of his mind. It wasn't just a resemblance, it was exact. The same high cheekbones, the same gentle curve of her lips, the same deep, soulful eyes that had captivated him from the moment he first saw Clara. But there was a difference, a subtle sadness in this woman's gaze, a weariness that Clara had never possessed. He was a man of logic, of facts and figures, a titan of industry who built empires on calculated risks and verifiable data. There was no data for this. It was a ghost, a doppelganger, a cruel trick of the universe. He tried to rationalize it. A distant relative? A coincidence of genetics so profound it defied probability? Every logical explanation felt flimsy, pathetic in the face of the raw, emotional certainty he had felt. His security chief, a stoic man named Marcus who had been with him for over a decade, entered the foyer, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes filled with concern. "Sir, is everything all right?" Julian looked up, his face pale, his composure shattered. "Find someone," he said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. "A woman. In the park, by the fountain. She has a daughter, maybe 5 or 6 years old. She's an artist." She was carrying a portfolio. He paused, the next words catching in his throat. She looks exactly like Clara." Marcus's professional impassivity flickered. He had known Clara. He had seen the devastating effect her loss had on his employer. He simply nodded, the unspoken questions hanging in the air between them. "I'll find her, sir." As Marcus left, Julian walked over to the sterile, minimalist fireplace, above which hung the only portrait of Clara he allowed in the house. It was an oil painting, commissioned for their first anniversary, capturing her laughing, her head thrown back in pure, uninhibited joy. Lily, now calm, walked over and stood beside him, her small hand finding his. "Daddy," she whispered. "Was that Mommy?" Julian knelt, his eyes level with his daughter's. How could he explain the unexplainable? "I don't know, sweetheart," he said, the admission of uncertainty, a foreign concept to him. "But I promise you, we're going to find out." The promise was as much for himself as it was for her. The fear was beginning to subside, replaced by a burning, all-consuming need for answers. The ghost in the park had awoken him from his 5-year slumber of grief. And now, for the first time since he lost Clara, Julian Croft had a mission. He would find this woman, and he would unravel the mystery that wore his wife's face. The search was swift and ruthlessly efficient. Julian Croft's world operated on a different set of rules, where privacy was a commodity and information was currency. Marcus, armed with a vague description and a location, mobilized a team that worked through the night. They cross-referenced park permits, accessed public surveillance footage, and ran facial recognition software against the grainy images they managed to pull. Within 24 hours, they had a name: Elena Reyes. The file that landed on Julian's desk was thin, a testament to a life lived without fanfare or public record. Her address was in a working-class neighborhood on the other side of the city, a world away from his polished enclave of wealth. The report listed her profession as a freelance artist, with a sporadic income that barely seemed to cover the rent on her small, second-floor apartment. There was a record of her daughter, Maya, age 5, enrolled in the local public school. And there, in the dry, bureaucratic details, was the piece of information that made Julian's blood run cold. Under family records, it listed a deceased twin sister, Clara Reyes. The name slammed into him with the force of a physical impact. Clara Reyes. His Clara. She had never spoken of a twin. In all their years together, in all their intimate conversations and shared secrets, she had never once mentioned having a sister, let alone an identical one. He felt a profound sense of betrayal, a confusion so deep it bordered on anger. Why would she hide something so fundamental? He thought back to their life together, searching his memory for any clue, any hint he might have missed. He remembered her talking about a difficult childhood, a family that didn't understand her choices, but she had always been vague, painting her past in broad, melancholic strokes. He had attributed it to a desire to leave a painful history behind, to focus on the future they were building together. He had never pressed her, respecting what he thought was a need for privacy. Now, he saw it as a deliberate omission, a secret that redefined the woman he thought he knew. The knowledge that a part of Clara, a living, breathing part of her, existed in the world, and he had never known, was a staggering revelation. This wasn't a ghost. This was family. This was a sister-in-law he never knew he had, a woman who shared his wife's face and, undoubtedly, his grief. The panic he had felt in the park was now replaced by a complex storm of emotions: anger at Clara's secrecy, sorrow for this unknown sister's loss, and an overwhelming, desperate need to connect with this last, unexpected piece of his wife's legacy. He looked again at the address on the file. It was a place he would never have had reason to go, a neighborhood his car's navigation system would probably designate as an avoided area, but now it was the most important location in the world. He had to go there. He had to see her, talk to her, understand the years of silence and the secret his wife had carried to her grave. He wasn't just searching for answers anymore. He was searching for a connection to the past he thought had been entirely extinguished. He was searching for Clara's sister. Elena was trying to force a sense of normalcy back into her life, a task that felt like trying to glue together the fragments of a shattered vase. She took Maya to school, bought groceries, and sat before her easel, but the creative fire that usually sustained her had been reduced to cold embers. Every face she saw on the street seemed to be his. Every crying child seemed to echo his daughter's haunting words. The encounter had unsettled something deep within her, shaking the very foundations of her identity. The resemblance to Clara had always been a simple fact of her life. Now it felt like a mysterious key to a door she never knew existed. That afternoon, as a persistent, dreary rain began to fall, mirroring the gloom that had settled in her soul, there was a knock on her door. It was a firm, hesitant knock, not the familiar rhythm of a neighbor or a delivery person. Maya was in her room, humming as she played with her dolls, a small pocket of sunshine in the gray apartment. Elena's heart beat a little faster as she walked to the door, a sense of foreboding washing over her. She peered through the peephole, and her breath caught in her throat. It was him, the man from the park. He stood in the dimly lit hallway of her building, water dripping from his dark coat, looking profoundly out of place. The cheap, peeling paint of the walls and the flickering overhead light seemed to shrink around his presence. His baseball cap was gone, and without it, she could see the sharp lines of his face, the undisguised wealth in the cut of his clothes, and the raw vulnerability in his eyes. He looked as lost and as haunted as he had by the fountain. She opened the door slowly, her hand gripping the edge of it like a shield. "Yes?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He didn't seem to know where to begin. His gaze swept over her face, the same look of disbelieving recognition from before, but this time it was tempered with a deep, searching sadness. "Elena Reyes?" he asked, his voice low and strained. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. "My name is Julian Croft," he said, the name meaning nothing to her. He paused, as if the next words were the heaviest he would ever have to lift. Clara was my wife." The world stopped. The hissing of the radiator, the rain against the windowpane, the sound of Maya humming in the other room, it all faded into a deafening silence. His wife, Clara's husband. The faceless, nameless man from her sister's gilded cage was standing in her doorway. The vague narrative of a distant, disapproving family she had constructed in her mind evaporated, replaced by this man's tangible, overwhelming grief. It all clicked into place with a horrifying, sickening clarity. The little girl, his daughter, was her niece. The scream in the park was not a mistake. It was the cry of a child recognizing her dead mother in the face of her aunt. Elena felt the strength drain from her legs, and she leaned against the doorframe for support. You were married to Clara?" she stammered, the question an empty echo of the confirmation she saw in his eyes. He simply nodded, his own composure cracking. He had come here for answers, to confront the secret, but seeing her standing there, the living image of his lost love, with the same shocked pain reflected in her eyes, dismantled his anger and left only a shared, cavernous sorrow. The sister she had lost to wealth, and the wife he had lost to death, were the same person, and they were two strangers united in the silent, echoing space of that loss. The rain outside intensified, beating a frantic rhythm against the old window panes as a heavy silence filled the space between them. Julian stood on the threshold, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and shaping skylines, now utterly adrift in the hallway of a modest apartment. Elena, rooted in her own shock, could only stare at him, seeing the ghost of her sister in the grief that etched his features. The chasm between their two worldshe's of unimaginable wealth, hers of quiet, dignified struggle, was suddenly bridged by the single, powerful bond of Clara. It was Elena who broke the silence, her voice fragile but clear. "Please," she said, stepping back. "Come in." It was an instinctual act of grace, an offering of shelter to a man who looked as lost as she felt. Julian stepped inside, his presence seeming to shrink the small, cluttered living space. The room was filled with the scent of paint and old books, a testament to a life of creativity and modest means. Canvases were stacked against one wall, sketches were pinned to a corkboard, and a worn but comfortable-looking sofa was draped with a colorful hand-knitted blanket. It was a home, filled with a warmth and personality that his own sterile penthouse painfully lacked. He looked around, his eyes taking in the details, searching for traces of the woman he had loved in this environment that was so alien to the one she had inhabited with him. "She never told me," he said, his voice raw. "She never mentioned a sister, a twin." The words were an accusation, but his tone was one of profound confusion, not anger. "I didn't know," Elena whispered, sinking onto the edge of the sofa. "I didn't know anything about you. Only that she had married someone from a different world." She looked up at him, her eyes pleading for understanding. She stopped writing. The calls stopped. I thought her new family didn't approve of us, that she was ashamed." Julian's heart ached at her words. The narrative of shame and disapproval was so far from the truth. He remembered Clara's quiet sadness when she spoke of her family, the way she would change the subject. He had seen it as her pain, not his. He had never imagined this parallel story of perceived abandonment playing out miles away. "No," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "No, she wasn't ashamed. She was. I think she was protecting you." "Protecting me?" Elena asked, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. "From what? A better life?" "From my world," Julian answered, his gaze sweeping the room again. "From the pressure, the expectations, the emptiness." He thought of the corporate dinners, the charity galas, the constant public scrutiny. Clara had navigated it all with grace, but he knew it had taken a toll. He now suspected she had kept her family, her twin, as a secret sanctuary, a part of herself that his world could not touch or tarnish. And in doing so, she had built a wall that had left them both alone in their grief. A small sound from the other room broke the spell. Maya appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide with curiosity, clutching a small, one-eyed teddy bear. She looked at Julian, then at her mother, sensing the heavy atmosphere. Julian's breath caught. The girl was the spitting image of Lily, but with Elena's dark, serious eyes. She was his niece. Another piece of Clara, living and breathing in this room. He was a man who had thought he had lost everything, and in the span of a day, he had discovered a world of connections he never knew existed. The weight of his wife's secret was immense, but for the first time, looking at Elena and her daughter, he felt a flicker of something other than loss. It was a fragile, terrifying sliver of hope. Maya approached slowly, her initial shyness warring with a child's natural curiosity. She hid partially behind Elena's legs, her gaze fixed on the tall stranger who made her mother look so sad. "Is he the man from the park?" she asked in a small voice. Elena placed a comforting hand on her daughter's head. "Yes, sweetie." This is Julian." Julian knelt, bringing himself down to Maya's level, an action that was both disarming and deeply paternal. His movements were slow, careful, as if not to frighten a timid fawn. He had spent 5 years channeling all his tenderness toward Lily. It was a language he was fluent in. "Hello, Maya," he said, his voice softer than Elena had ever heard it. "It's very nice to meet you." He offered a small, hesitant smile, a stark contrast to the tormented expression he had worn just moments before. Maya, seeing no threat, took a tentative step forward. "Lily is your little girl," she stated, not as a question, but as a fact she had processed. "Yes, she is," Julian confirmed. The simplicity of the children's world was a stark relief from the tangled complexity of the adults, Lily and Maya, cousins, two little girls who shared a connection they couldn't possibly comprehend yet. The thought was both heartbreaking and beautiful. "I have a picture," Elena found herself saying, her voice still trembling slightly. She rose and went to a small wooden box on her bookshelf, the one place she kept her most precious mementos. She retrieved the worn photograph of Clara and handed it to Julian. He took it with a hand that was not quite steady. He had thousands of pictures of his wife, professional portraits, candid snapshots, digital albums filled with her image. But this one was different. This was Clara before him. This was Clara Reyes, not Clara Croft. She was younger, her face unlined by the subtle pressures of his world. It was the face of the woman Elena knew, the sister she had grown up with. He stared at it for a long time, the silence in the room thick with unspoken memories. He was seeing his wife through another's eyes, a version of her from a past he had no part in. "She looks happy," he said quietly, a statement thick with the sorrow of all the happiness that had been stolen from them. "She was," Elena confirmed. "Before she left." The words hung in the air, a gentle accusation born of years of hurt. Julian finally looked up from the photograph, his eyes meeting hers. "I am so sorry," he said, and the apology was vast, covering everything. Sorry for her loss. Sorry for his part in the silence. Sorry for the secrets his wife had kept. Sorry that they had to meet like this, two strangers bound by a shared ghost. The apology was a crack in the dam, and Elena felt the tightly coiled grief within her begin to unwind. Tears she hadn't shed for years, tears of anger, confusion, and profound loneliness, pricked at the back of her eyes. She had mourned the sister she lost to a different life. Now she had to mourn her all over again, the finality of her death made real by the grieving husband standing in her living room. This man and his daughter were not just a bizarre coincidence. They were her family. A broken, scattered family, pieced together by a tragedy, but family nonetheless. The central mystery was solved, but its resolution opened up 100 new questions, 100 new pains, and the terrifying, uncharted territory of what came next. The initial shock began to recede, leaving in its place the raw, tender landscape of shared sorrow. Julian did not leave. He stayed, sitting awkwardly on her worn sofa, a billionaire in a cheap apartment, held there by a force stronger than any business deal, the mutual gravity of their loss. They talked for hours, the rain a constant, drumming accompaniment to their halting conversation. They pieced together the last years of Clara's life from their two disparate viewpoints, creating a mosaic of the woman they had both loved. Elena spoke of their childhood, of whispered secrets in the dark, of their identical dresses and shared dreams. She described a vibrant, fearless girl who always wanted more from life, who felt constrained by their modest upbringing. Julian listened, captivated, learning about a side of his wife he had never known. He, in turn, told Elena about their life together. He described how Clara had lit up his sterile world of wealth, how she had filled his quiet mansion with laughter and love. He spoke of her kindness, her generosity, and the subtle melancholy that he now understood was homesickness for a sister she had left behind. "I never understood why she wouldn't let me meet her family," Julian confessed, his voice heavy with regret. "She always said it was complicated, that they wouldn't approve of me, of this life. I thought she was protecting me from their judgment." Elena shook her head, a sad smile touching her lips. "And I thought she was protecting herself from ours. We were so close, and then she was just gone, into a world I couldn't imagine. I was hurt. I was angry. I should have tried harder to reach her." They were two people who had built narratives around a silence, and both of them had been wrong. Clara hadn't been ashamed, nor had she been protecting herself. She had been trying to protect them from each other, to keep her two worlds separate, believing they could never coexist. In her misguided attempt to shield them from pain, she had inadvertently caused a deeper, more profound isolation. As they talked, Maya, having grown accustomed to Julian's presence, brought out her drawing pad. She sat on the floor, sketching with intense concentration. After a while, she tore off the sheet and shyly presented it to Julian. It was a child's drawing of two little girls with big smiles, holding hands. One had bright yellow hair, the other dark brown. Underneath, she had written their names, Lily and Maya. Julian took the drawing, his throat tightening. In the simple, innocent art of a 5-year-old was a truth more powerful than all their adult complexities. It was a picture of a future, of a connection that was just beginning. He looked from the drawing to Alina, whose eyes were glistening with unshed tears. The grief was still there, a vast and permanent ocean, but for the first time, in this small, cluttered apartment, surrounded by the smell of paint and the quiet presence of his newly discovered family, Julian felt the distant shore of something that might one day be peace. He knew he couldn't just walk out of this woman's life. The revelation of her existence was not an endpoint, but a beginning. He had a sister-in-law. His daughter had an aunt and a cousin. He had a duty, not of charity, but of family. He had to bridge the gap that Clara, in her love and fear, had created. The days that followed were a delicate dance of discovery. Julian found himself drawn back to Elena's small apartment, a magnetic pull he couldn't ignore. He would show up under the guise of bringing news or a small gift for Maya, but both he and Elena knew the real reason. He was seeking the warmth and authenticity that filled her home, a stark contrast to the echoing silence of his own. He began to see Clara in Elena's mannerisms, the way she would bite her lip when concentrating on a sketch, the gentle cadence of her voice when she spoke to Maya. Yet, he also saw the profound differences. Where Clara had been a bright, burning flame, Elena was a steady, resilient glow. She possessed a quiet strength, a dignity forged in hardship that he found himself deeply admiring. He insisted on creating a formal arrangement to provide for her and Maya, framing it not as charity, but as fulfilling Clara's unspoken will. "She would have wanted me to take care of her family," he stated, his tone leaving no room for argument. Elena, fiercely independent, resisted at first. She was not a project, not a problem to be solved with money. "We are fine, Julian," she said, her pride a fragile shield. "We have always managed." "I know," he replied gently, understanding her hesitation. "This isn't about managing. This is about family. Let me do this, Elena. For her. For the girls." He wasn't just offering money. He was offering security, a chance for her to pursue her art without the constant, crushing weight of financial worry. He set up a trust for Maya's education and provided Elena with a stipend that would allow her to focus solely on her painting. It was a transactional solution to an emotional reality, but it was the only way he knew how to begin building a bridge. The true bridge, however, was being built by their daughters. Julian arranged for Lily and Maya to meet properly, away from the charged emotions of their parents. He brought Lily to the park, the same park where their lives had collided, and Elena brought Maya. The two girls, who were virtual strangers yet shared the same blood, stared at each other for a long moment, a silent, solemn recognition passing between them. Then, Lily, with the uninhibited confidence of a child loved securely, broke the silence. "Your mom looks like my mom," she said simply. Maya nodded. "I know. They were twins." And with that simple exchange, the wall of strangeness dissolved. They spent the afternoon playing on the swings, their laughter mingling in the crisp autumn air. They were instant allies, two halves of a whole they were just beginning to understand. Julian and Elena watched from a bench, their conversation stilted but their shared focus absolute. They were no longer just two grieving individuals. They were parents, architects of a new and fragile family structure. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the park, Julian turned to Elena. "I have a house in the country," he said. "It's quiet there. Clara loved it. I think you and Maya should come for a weekend. All of us." It was more than an invitation. It was a test. A step from the neutral ground of the park into the heart of his world, the world that had once belonged to Clara. Elena hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "We'd like that." The drive to the country house was a journey into another dimension. Elena watched the gray, cramped cityscape of her life recede in the rearview mirror, replaced by rolling green hills and a vast, open sky. Maya was pressed against the window of Julian's luxury sedan, her eyes wide with an almost reverent awe. The car itself was a marvel to her, a silent, gliding vessel of impossible comfort. Elena felt a familiar pang of anxiety, the feeling of being an imposter in a world she didn't belong to. This was Clara's world, the life she had chosen. The house, when it came into view, was less of a house and more of a sprawling stone and glass masterpiece, nestled seamlessly into a landscape of ancient trees and manicured gardens. It was beautiful, elegant, and to Elena, profoundly intimidating. Lily greeted them at the door, her excitement palpable, and immediately whisked Maya away to show her the secret garden and the pony in the stables. The two girls disappeared, their joyful shrieks echoing in the cavernous entrance hall, leaving Elena and Julian standing in an awkward silence. "It's beautiful," Elena said, the word feeling inadequate. "Clara designed most of the interior herself," Julian said, a sad fondness in his voice. "She had an incredible eye." He led her through the house, each room a pristine, perfectly preserved monument to his late wife. Her favorite books were still on the nightstand, her favorite cashmere throw was still draped over a chaise lounge, a vase of her favorite flowers, white lilies, sat on the grand piano. It was a museum of a life, exquisitely maintained but devoid of a living presence. Elena felt like a ghost walking through another ghost's home. The house was filled with Clara, but it was a curated, idealized version. It lacked the messy, vibrant chaos of Elena's own small apartment, the smell of paint, the scattered toys, the evidence of a life being actively lived. As the day wore on, Elena found herself observing Julian in his natural habitat. She saw the way his staff deferred to him with a quiet, efficient respect, the way he moved through the enormous space with an air of lonely ownership. He was powerful, in control, yet he seemed as much a visitor in this house as she was. He was the keeper of the museum, the guardian of the memories, but he wasn't truly living in it. That evening, after the girls were asleep in their separate, beautifully appointed rooms, Elena found Julian in the library, staring into a cold, unlit fireplace. A half-empty glass of whiskey sat on the table beside him. She would be happy, seeing them together, Elena said softly from the doorway. Julian turned, a weary smile on his face. She would. She always wanted Lily to have a sister. The admission hung in the air, heavy with unspoken what-ifs. "This place?" Elena said, gesturing to the room. "It's like she just stepped out for a moment." Julian nodded, his gaze distant. "I suppose I've kept it that way. I thought if I changed anything, it would feel like I was erasing her." "You could never erase her," Elena said, her voice full of a certainty that surprised them both. "She's in you. She's in Lily. And," she paused, "she's in me." He looked at her then, truly looked at her, not as a reflection of his wife, but as her own person. A woman of strength and grace who had weathered storms he could only imagine. In her eyes, he didn't just see Clara's ghost. He saw a flicker of life, of resilience, of a future he hadn't dared to consider. The weekend was a turning point, a fragile step across the chasm that had separated their worlds. It was the first time they were together, not as grieving strangers, but as the tentative, uncertain beginnings of a family. The juxtaposition of their lives became a source of gentle, situational humor that began to chip away at the ever-present sorrow. When Julian, in a gesture of goodwill, sent a car to pick up Maya for a playdate, the sleek black vehicle looked absurdly out of place parked on the cracked pavement of Elena's street, drawing curious stares from all her neighbors. Maya, who had never been in a car that didn't have a mysterious rattle, treated the experience with the solemnity of a royal procession, reporting back to her mother that the seats felt like clouds and that there were bottles of water just for looking at. Conversely, when Julian and Lily visited Elena's apartment, it was an adventure into another kind of kingdom. Lily was fascinated by the organized chaos of Elena's studio, the vibrant colors and smells. She touched the rough texture of the canvases with a sense of wonder, a world away from the digital screens and sterile playrooms she was used to. She was mesmerized by the fact that Elena could create a face, a world, with nothing but a piece of charcoal and her hands. "Can you teach me?" she asked, her eyes wide. And Elena spent an afternoon showing both girls how to mix colors, their small hands and faces soon covered in a rainbow of paint, their laughter filling the small apartment with a joyous energy it hadn't known in years. Julian watched from the sidelines, a hesitant smile playing on his lips. He saw a light in his daughter he hadn't seen since Clara was alive. She was not just happy. She was engaged, curious, grounded. This small, cluttered apartment, which at first had seemed a symbol of hardship, was now revealing itself to be a place of warmth, creativity, and love. He began to see the richness in Elena's life, a wealth that had nothing to do with money. It was in the way she and Maya would read together every night, curled up on the old sofa, or in the proud smile on Elena's face when she finished a painting, regardless of whether it would sell. These moments of connection were something he had craved, something his vast fortune could never buy. He found himself trying to bridge the gap in his own way. He brought over a bag of groceries once, filled with exotic fruits and expensive cheeses, a clumsy but well-intentioned offering. Elena had laughed, a genuine, musical laugh. "Julian, this is lovely, but Maya thinks a pineapple is a spaceship. We don't know what to do with half of this." They ended up looking up recipes online, a billionaire and a struggling artist awkwardly trying to figure out how to properly cut a mango in a tiny kitchen. Their shared ineptitude a surprising source of camaraderie. These small, shared experiences were like threads, slowly, carefully weaving their two disparate lives together. The grief was still there, a constant undertone to their interactions, but it was no longer the only note in their song. It was now harmonizing with new sounds, the laughter of their children, the tentative notes of a new friendship, and the quiet, surprising rhythm of two lonely people finding solace in the most unexpected of circumstances. The ghost of Clara was still with them, but her presence was changing. She was no longer a barrier of secrets and sorrow, but the foundation upon which they were cautiously, bravely, beginning to build something new. As the weeks turned into a month, a comfortable rhythm began to establish itself. Playdates became a regular occurrence, and weekend visits to the country house became a standing invitation. Julian saw to it that Elena's work was seen by the right people. He arranged a private showing of her art for a gallery owner, a friend of his, who was immediately taken by the raw emotion and technical skill in her sketches and paintings. The gallery offered her a solo exhibition, a dream Elena had long since abandoned as an impossible fantasy. She was hesitant, overwhelmed by the suddenness of it all, feeling as though it was a product of Julian's influence rather than her own merit. "I don't want charity, Julian," she told him, her pride still a formidable fortress. "This isn't charity," he insisted, his voice firm but gentle. "I only opened the door. Your talent is what's walking through it. This is all you, Elena." He was right, and she knew it. The opportunity was real, and it was a chance to finally provide for Maya on her own terms, with her own gift. The acceptance of the exhibition was a significant step, a moment where she allowed herself to accept the help he was offering, not as a handout, but as the support of family. Meanwhile, the bond between Lily and Maya deepened into a fierce, protective sisterhood. They were a study in contrasts: Lily, with her sunny disposition and privileged confidence; Maya, with her quiet observations and old-soul gravity. Yet, they fit together perfectly, each balancing the other. Lily taught Maya how to swim in the heated indoor pool at Julian's mansion. Maya taught Lily how to make stories out of the shapes of clouds from the window of their apartment. They were creating their own shared world, one that was a seamless blend of their two realities. Julian found himself spending more and more time away from his sterile office and the demands of his empire. He started attending Maya's school events, sitting awkwardly among the other parents, a titan of industry watching a 5-year-old in a homemade sheep costume during a school play. He helped Elena stretch canvases in her studio, his bespoke suit jacket thrown over a chair, his hands smudged with charcoal. He was slowly, cautiously, re-engaging with the world, not as the powerful Julian Croft, but simply as Lily's father and Maya's uncle. He was discovering a part of himself he thought had died with Clarathi, man who could find joy in simple things, the man who could be vulnerable. One evening, as he was leaving Elena's apartment, Maya ran to him and gave him a fierce hug around his legs. "Don't go yet, Uncle Julian," she said, her voice muffled against his trousers. The title, Uncle Julian, spoken so naturally, so innocently, struck him with a profound force. It was a simple word, but it was a word of belonging. It solidified his place in this small, warm world she and Elena had created. He looked over at Elena, who was watching them from the kitchen doorway, a soft, sad smile on her face. In that moment, the space between them was filled with a silent understanding. They were no longer just connected by the past, they were actively building a present. A fragile, complicated, and unexpectedly beautiful present. The shadow of Clara's secret was finally giving way to the light of this new, unconventional family. The news of Julian Croft's new interest began to ripple through the rarefied circles he inhabited. The tabloids, long starved of any personal news about the billionaire recluse, began to buzz with speculation. A photographer caught a long-lens shot of him at the park with Lily, Maya, and a mystery woman who bore a striking resemblance to his late wife. The story wrote itself. The grieving widower, unable to move on, had found a look-alike. The narrative was cruel, simplistic, and dangerously close to a truth they could never understand. The real test, however, came not from the faceless media, but from a much more formidable source: Eleanor Vance, Clara and Julian's mother. Eleanor was a woman carved from granite, the matriarch of an old-money family who saw the world in terms of lineage, propriety, and power. She had adored Clara, her only child, and had viewed her death as a devastating blow to the family's legacy. She had maintained a cool, distant relationship with Julian, bound to him only by their shared grief and their mutual love for Lily. Upon hearing the rumors, Eleanor descended upon the country house like a storm front, her disapproval a palpable force. She arrived unannounced, her silver hair perfectly coiffed, her eyes missing nothing. She found Julian not in his study poring over stock reports, but in the garden with Elena, helping her plant a small bed of daisies while the girls made mud pies nearby. The sight of Elena Clara's face on a woman in dirt-stained jeans was a profound shock to Eleanor. Her expression hardened, her polite smile becoming a thin, sharp line. "Julian," she said, her voice like ice, "I see the rumors are true." Though I must admit, they failed to capture the sheer audacity of the situation. Elena felt herself shrink under the woman's cold, appraising gaze. All her insecurities came rushing back. She was the poor relation, the imposter, the living echo of a woman this powerful matriarch had actually loved. Julian, however, stood his ground. The man who had once retreated from the world now stood as a protector of his new, fragile one. "Eleanor," he said, his tone calm but unyielding, "this is Elena Reyes, Clara's sister, and this is her daughter, Maya." If the sight of Elena was a shock, this news was a seismic event. Eleanor stared at Elena, her composure cracking for a fraction of a second. "Clara's sister? That's impossible. Clara never had a sister." "A twin sister," Julian corrected gently. "It's a long story, one Clara kept from all of us." But Eleanor was not interested in long stories. She was interested in damage control. Her mind, sharp and strategic, immediately saw the implications. A secret sister from a poor background, an identical face, a billionaire widower. To her, it looked like the script of a sordid, opportunistic play. "And you," Eleanor said, turning her full attention to Elena, her voice dripping with condescension. "How convenient for you that you happened to find my son-in-law just when you needed him. Tell me, how long did you wait after Clara's death to put your plan into motion?" The accusation was brutal, a direct assault on Elena's integrity. Julian stepped forward, his anger a low, dangerous rumble. "That's enough, Eleanor." But Elena held up a hand, stopping him. She would not let him fight this battle for her. She rose from the garden, wiping her hands on her jeans, and met the older woman's icy gaze with her own quiet dignity. The strength she had forged through years of hardship was now her armor. Elena faced the formidable matriarch, her heart pounding but her voice steady. The years of being overlooked, of being judged for her modest circumstances, had paradoxically prepared her for this moment. She had nothing to pretend to be, nothing to lose but a dignity she would never surrender. "Mrs. Vance," she began, her tone respectful but firm, "I understand your shock and your suspicion. If the situations were reversed, I might feel the same way. But you must understand, I knew nothing of my sister's life with you, just as you knew nothing of me." She paused, letting the words sink in. "I did not find Julian. Our meeting was an accident, a painful one for everyone. I loved my sister. I grieved for her in silence for 5 years, believing she had simply chosen to leave me behind. Learning of her death from the man she married was not a convenient opportunity. It was the reopening of a wound I thought had scarred over long ago." Her words were simple, honest, and devoid of the artifice and strategy that defined Eleanor's world. She wasn't pleading or defending. She was stating the truth as she had lived it. The raw authenticity of her speech seemed to momentarily disarm the older woman. Eleanor looked from Elena's earnest, pained face to Julian's fiercely protective one. She saw the two little girls, her granddaughter and this new child, playing together, utterly oblivious to the adult drama, their shared laughter a testament to a bond that had already formed. Her cold certainty began to waver, confronted by a reality far more complex than the scandalous narrative she had imagined. Julian stepped beside Elena, a quiet gesture of solidarity that was more powerful than any angry outburst. "Elena and Maya are family, Eleanor," he said, his voice leaving no room for negotiation. "They are my family. They are Lily's family. You can either accept that, or you can choose to stand outside of it. The choice is yours." It was an ultimatum, delivered with a calm authority that Eleanor had not seen in him since before Clara's death. This was not the broken, grieving man she had grown accustomed to. This was a man who had found something to live for again, something to protect. The climax was not a shouting match or a dramatic confrontation, but this quiet, unshakable stand. It was Julian, finally and fully, choosing his new life, his new family, and defending its honor against the ghosts and judgments of the past. He was no longer just the keeper of Clara's memory. He was the builder of a new legacy, one founded not on lineage or wealth, but on the unexpected, resilient bonds of love and shared humanity. Eleanor stood there for a long moment, the warring factions of pride, skepticism, and a dawning understanding playing across her features. The situation was not what she had expected. The woman before her was not a cunning opportunist, but a person of substance and grace. Her son-in-law was not a fool being played, but a man coming back to life. The emotional climax of their story rested on her response, on her capacity to see beyond the surface, beyond the convenient story, to the complicated, messy, and beautiful truth. Eleanor Vance was a woman who had built her life on control and predictable outcomes. This situation was anything but. She looked at Elena's face, an achingly familiar canvas of features, yet the expression in the eyes was different. It held a resilience, a quiet depth that Clara, sheltered and adored, had never needed to develop. She saw the way Julian stood by her side, not as a besotted fool, but as a partner, an equal. And she heard the genuine, unadulterated joy in her granddaughter's laughter as she played with her newfound cousin. In that moment, something within the rigid matriarch shifted. It wasn't a sudden, dramatic change of heart, but a slow, reluctant erosion of her certainty. She saw the possibility that her narrative, the one of scandal and opportunism, was wrong. She saw the profound loneliness in Julian's life beginning to recede, replaced by a warmth he had not known for 5 years. She saw a second chance, not just for him, but for Lily. To deny this would be to prioritize her own pride over her granddaughter's happiness. Her gaze softened almost imperceptibly. "Clara always was full of secrets," she said, the words a quiet admission, a concession. It was not an apology, but it was an opening, a crack in the icy facade. She walked over to where the girls were playing, her movements stiff but deliberate. She knelt, an action that seemed to cost her a great deal, and looked at Maya. "You have your mother's eyes," she said, her voice softer than anyone had heard it in years. It was a simple observation, but it was an acknowledgement. It was acceptance. The crisis had passed. The swift, silent resolution hung in the air, as cleansing as a summer rain after a long drought. Julian had stood his ground. Elena had proven her worth through her quiet dignity, and Eleanor, in her own guarded way, had relented. The family, in its new, strange configuration, had weathered its first and most formidable storm. The external threat had only served to solidify their internal bond, proving that what they were building was real and strong enough to withstand the pressures of the outside world. The rest of the weekend passed in a state of careful, quiet truce, the foundation of a new, more honest relationship being laid one hesitant conversation at a time. The victory was not loud or triumphant, but it was profound. It was the victory of love over suspicion, of family over formality, of a hopeful future over a painful past. The solo exhibition was a resounding success. The art world, initially drawn in by the mystique of the story, the reclusive billionaire's secret sister-in-law, stayed for the art itself. Elena's work, filled with the raw emotion and poignant observations of a life lived in the margins, resonated deeply with critics and collectors alike. Her charcoal portraits captured the weary dignity of the city's overlooked souls, and her vibrant paintings pulsed with a resilient, hard-won hope. On the opening night, the gallery was filled with a glittering crowd, a world away from the quiet solitude of her studio. Elena stood amongst them, dressed not in her usual paint-splattered jeans, but in an elegant dark blue dress that Julian had insisted on buying for her, feeling like a visitor in her own success. But when she saw Maya, holding hands with Lily, looking at her paintings with a proud, shining light in her eyes, all the anxiety melted away. This was real. She had earned this. Julian stood back, observing, a quiet, profound pride on his face. He saw not a project he had funded, but a brilliant artist coming into her own. Later that evening, he found her looking at a large canvas she had painted in the final weeks before the show. It was a departure from her usual work. It depicted two women, their faces identical, standing on opposite sides of a chasm. One was surrounded by gray, muted tones, the other by brilliant, almost blinding gold. But their hands were reaching for each other across the divide, their fingers almost touching. "It's the last one I finished," she said softly. "It's for her. She would have loved it," Julian said, his voice thick with emotion. He stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching. The space between them was no longer filled with awkwardness or the heavy weight of grief, but with a comfortable, quiet understanding. They had navigated the labyrinth of their shared loss and had found their way, not back to what they had lost, but to something new. The success of the exhibition gave Elena financial independence, but she chose not to leave her small apartment. It was her home, her sanctuary, the place where she had raised her daughter and honed her craft. Instead, she used the money to buy the entire floor, knocking down walls to create a vast, light-filled studio and living space, a kingdom of her own making. She didn't need Julian's world, she had expanded her own. Julian, in turn, began to change his. The sterile, museum-like mansion began to show signs of life. Maya's colorful drawings were now proudly displayed on the multi-million-dollar refrigerator. The formal living room was often littered with Lily's toys and Maya's art supplies. The house was slowly, surely, becoming a home again, filled with the sounds of life, laughter, and the occasional joyous argument between cousins. He delegated more of his company's operations, choosing to spend his afternoons not in boardrooms, but at the park or in Elena's studio, learning from the girls how to see the world not in terms of profit and loss, but in shades of color and light. One year after their fateful meeting in the park, the four of them stood on a windswept hill overlooking the ocean. It had been Clara's favorite spot, a place she said made her feel both infinitesimally small and infinitely free. They were here not to mourn, but to remember, and to celebrate the new life that had grown from the ashes of the old. Lily and Maya, now inseparable, chased each other through the tall grass, their laughter carried away by the sea breeze. Elena had brought her sketchbook, but it lay forgotten beside her. She was no longer just capturing life, she was living it. Julian stood beside her, the haunted look in his eyes finally gone, replaced by a calm, quiet contentment. He was no longer a recluse hiding from the world, but a man fully present in it. He had not replaced what he had lost. One cannot replace a soul. Instead, he had allowed his heart to expand, to make room for a new kind of love, a new kind of family. He had learned that grief was not a hole to be filled, but a space that could be shared, and in sharing it, its sharp edges could be softened. "Thank you," he said suddenly, his voice low against the sound of the waves. Elena turned to him, a question in her eyes. "For what?" "For everything," he said, his gaze sweeping from her to the two girls playing in the distance. "For showing me that a house is not a home, for bringing the color back into my life, for giving Lily a family, for sharing Clara with me." Elena's heart swelled with an emotion that was a mix of sorrow for what was lost and immense gratitude for what was found. "She's the one who brought us together," she whispered. "She's still taking care of us." They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching their daughters, two bright sparks of life against the vast expanse of the sea and sky. The past was a part of their story, the foundation upon which they were built, but it was no longer their entire narrative. The story was now about two little girls who were sisters in every way that mattered. It was about a woman who found her voice through her art, and a man who found his heart in the quiet moments of family. It was a modern-day fairy tale, Not about a prince saving a pauper, but about two broken families finding a way to become whole again, together. The little girl's scream in the park, a cry born of grief and confusion, had become an unexpected, beautiful beginning. It had not been the end of a story, but the start of a new one, a story of redemption, of hope, and of the enduring, mysterious power of love to find its way through the darkest of nights.